Usually when you think about a legally binding contract, you assume the language is entirely locked down.
Right, yeah. Completely ironclad.
Exactly. Every clause, every comma, it's all there in black and white.
Yeah.
And if someone manages to subtly change just one word, the entire agreement shifts.
Oh, absolutely.
Like you might think you're signing over your old car, but because of a single swapped term, you've suddenly handed over the deed to your house.
It's a terrifying thought, honestly, but, it highlights how entirely reliant those systems are on absolute precision.
Yeah.
I mean, the core meaning has to remain fixed, or the whole foundational structure essentially just falls apart.
And as a learner, you probably tend to assume that foundational historical texts have that exact same kind of lockdown, unquestionable precision.
Right, especially major religious texts.
Exactly. We treat them as these fixed monuments. But today, we are taking you on a deep dive into an ancient text where a perceived translation shift didn't just change a personal contract.
No, it literally shaped the course of world history.
It really did. So, welcome to the deep dive. If you are always looking for those massive paradigm-shifting aha moments that completely reframe how you see the past, you're definitely going to want to hear this one.
Yeah, you really are. We are looking at a deeply researched theological and exegetical essay by Frank Leo and a team of colleagues.
Actually, there is only one author. All the names mentioned are the author's names in different languages.
And it's titled The Exousia Hyperresa, Romans 13 as submission to Christ, not to worldly power.
That's the one. And, their core mission in this paper is, it's nothing short of revolutionary.
It really is.
They are proposing a radical retranslation of Romans 13, which is easily one of the most famous and heavily debated chapters in the Christian New Testament.
And to really grasp the stakes here, you have to look at how this specific passage has been utilized.
Or weaponized, as the essay argues.
Right, weaponized for 2 millennia. I mean, for centuries, monarchs, tyrants, and, state-aligned theologians have pointed to Romans 13 to demand absolute, unquestioning obedience to civil government.
Oh, yeah. The historical examples are wild.
They really are. The essay points out that King James I of England used it to justify the divine right of kings.
Yep.
The Third Reich used it to demand compliance from the church.
Exactly.
It was heavily cited by defenders of American slavery and later by the architects of apartheid in South Africa. All of them wielded this exact passage to crush dissent and enforce submission to earthly power.
It has essentially functioned as the ultimate divine blank check for the state.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
The traditional reading, the one most people are familiar with, basically says, submit to the government because God put the government there. If you resist the state, you resist God.
Before we go any further, though, a really important note for you listening. As always on the deep dive, we aren't here to take a theological or political side.
Right, of course.
We aren't endorsing any specific viewpoint on state authority or religious compliance. We are simply, unpacking the fascinating and highly debated arguments made by Frank Leo and his team in their source essay.
And their argument is that the entire world has fundamentally misread this passage for 2,000 years.
Which is just a staggering claim.
It is. But by going back and looking closely at the original Greek, Syriac, and Coptic languages, they are making the case that Romans 13 isn't a demand for compliance at all.
Not at all.
No, it is actually a subversive rallying cry.
Okay, so let's unpack this. If everyone read this as submit to earthly governments for centuries, how could they be so incredibly wrong?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it?
Right. Are the essay's authors suggesting that history just translated it poorly on purpose, like some kind of smoky room conspiracy to control the masses?
The authors suggest it wasn't necessarily a sinister conspiracy at the point of origin.
Right.
It was more of a profound shift in the political lens of the readers.
Okay, what does that mean?
Think about the Constantinian shift.
Oh, right.
Once the Roman Empire officially adopted Christianity, the theologians translating and interpreting these texts were suddenly aligned with the state.
They weren't the ones being fed to the lions anymore.
Exactly. They were no longer the persecuted minority. They were in the halls of power. And when you read a text from the perspective of the imperial palace rather than, a prison cell, your understanding of words like authority begins to morph.
So they basically just read their own political reality back into the text.
Precisely. Which brings us to the original Koine Greek and how it actually functions on the page.
Let's get into the grammar.
So the critical phrase in the very first verse of Romans 13 is exousias hyperrecuses,
Okay.
which traditionally gets translated as the governing authorities or the higher powers.
Right, the politicians.
That's the traditional view. But if you break down that Greek participle, hyperrecuses, it comes from hyper, meaning above, and echo, to hold.
So holding above.
Exactly. It means to hold above, to surpass, to excel. It denotes a surpassing ultimate authority.
Wow.
And to understand what the Apostle Paul meant by that, we really have to look at his own specific vocabulary across his other letters.
Right, because he's not writing in a vacuum. I mean, if I use a specific corporate buzzword in an email on Monday, I probably mean the exact same thing when I use it in a memo on Thursday.
That is the exact mechanism of textual analysis we need to use here.
Okay, so where else does he use it?
In his letter to the Philippians, chapter 2, Paul talks about God giving Jesus the name that is above every name. And he uses that exact same hyperprefix.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, he is explicitly declaring Christ as the supreme exousia, the absolute highest authority.
And the essay points out that Paul writes in Romans 13, there is no authority except from God.
Yes.
Which, when I read that in the source material, it immediately triggered a memory for me because it perfectly mirrors that standoff with Pilate in John's Gospel.
Oh, that's a brilliant connection.
Yeah, like Pilate is threatening him, throwing all the weight of the Roman Empire around, and Jesus just looks at him and clarifies that his authority is strictly from above.
It's an undeniable parallel, and the essay connects it even further to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28.
What happens there?
That's where the resurrected Christ declares, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me.
Ah.
And the Greek word there is, again, exousia. So the authors argue that the exousia, hyperrechusa, the surpassing supreme authority Paul is telling believers to submit to in Romans 13, isn't Caesar.
Right.
It isn't the local governor. It's Christ himself.
So if the Greek points heavily toward Christ, how did early non-Greek readers understand it?
That's a great question.
Like, did other ancient translations catch this supreme authority nuance, or were they fooled by the imperial lens too?
That is where the linguistic evidence gets really, really compelling. We have to look at the Syriac Peshitta.
The Syriac Peshitta.
Yeah. This is an ancient and incredibly important translation of the New Testament. It gives us a Semitic perspective that's much closer to the original context of the early church.
Okay, so what does it say?
Well, when the Syriac translates this specific phrase about authority, it uses the word rebutha.
Rebutha.
Right. Now, rebutha doesn't just mean generic greatness or supreme rank in a civic sense. It specifically translates to priesthood.
Wait, priesthood?
Yes.
That completely moves the venue. I mean, we're not in a courthouse or a Senate building anymore. We're in a temple.
Exactly. It completely reframes the power dynamic. It reveals a sacral religious dimension that the traditional political translation just entirely misses.
Yeah, that's a massive shift.
The authorities of Rebutha cannot possibly be secular Roman bureaucrats.
Yeah.
They are priestly, divine authorities. And in the context of early Christian theology, that points directly to Christ.
Because he's the high priest.
Right. He is described extensively in the book of Hebrews as both the ultimate king and the high priest.
It's like finding an old, faded memo in a corporate office that demands absolute respect and submission for the ultimate boss with the corner office.
Okay, I like this analogy.
And for years, everyone assumes it means your immediate middle manager, like the guy who approves your time off requests.
Yes.
Right. But when you actually read the specific corporate jargon used in the memo, you realize it's talking about the CEO of the entire multinational conglomerate.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it. And if we apply that CEO logic, the traditional reading of the rest of the passage really starts to unravel fast.
So?
Because if the surpassing authority is the CEO Jesus and not the middle manager, the Roman Empire, then it changes the identity of every other figure mentioned in the text.
Oh, true.
For instance, the text later talks about a servant of God who bears a sword.
Wait, if Jesus is the CEO in this analogy, is Paul saying Jesus is carrying a sword to punish people?
Well, think about the alternative.
Right. If we follow the old translation, it implies Nero, or whoever the Roman emperor is at the time, is God's special servant bearing a literal weapon.
Which requires a massive, almost contradictory theological leap.
Yeah.
But let's look at the mechanics of the language again.
Okay.
The essay breaks down the specific Greek title used here, Taikados Theo, or servant of God. Within the early Christian community, this is a highly Christological title. Jesus himself established this paradigm, stating that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve.
And it taps into a much older prophetic tradition as well, doesn't it?
Deeply so. It echoes the Hebrew prophetic tradition of the Ebed YHWH, the servant of YHWH, which is prominently featured in Isaiah 42.
Right. Behold my servant, I will uphold him.
Exactly. And what's crucial here is that in the Greek Septuagint, which is the translation of the Old Testament that Paul and the early church used, that servant is described as being exalted.
Using the same words.
Yes, using the exact same root words Paul uses in Romans 13 and Philippians 2 to describe Jesus. The linguistic through line is unbroken.
That's wild.
The servant of God isn't a political ruler. It points to Christ, the suffering servant king.
Okay, I get the linguistic connection for the title, but what about the sword?
The sword is fascinating.
Because Roman emperors have actual literal metal swords used to execute people. If Jesus is the authority being discussed, what sword is he carrying?
The authors argue that the sword, the Mashera in Greek, is deeply misunderstood if we read it as the literal weapon of a Roman legionary.
So it's a metaphor.
In the broader literary context of the New Testament, yes. The sword functions as a powerful symbolic image.
Where else do we see it?
In Revelation 19, you have the apocalyptic image of a sharp sword proceeding directly from Christ's mouth to execute divine judgment.
Oh, right.
And in Hebrews 4, the Word of God itself is described as being living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword.
So it's not physical violence?
Exactly. The sword in Romans 13 represents divine judgment and truth, not state-sanctioned violence.
Man, the vocabulary just keeps piling up against the traditional reading.
And we haven't even talked about the taxes yet.
Oh, right, because the text also talks about paying taxes and revenue because these authorities are ministers of God. But the Greek word used, there isn't a tax term, right? It's liturgoi.
Yes, liturgoi, which is the root of our modern word liturgy.
Right.
And this is where the traditional reading becomes almost entirely incoherent. Liturgoi is not a political, civic, or bureaucratic term. It is an intensely liturgical, sacral, priestly term.
Okay, so it has nothing to do with Roman taxes.
No. In the Greek Old Testament, it's used specifically for priests serving at the altar in the temple. Paul uses it elsewhere to describe Jesus as a minister of the holy things in the true heavenly tabernacle.
So applying that highly sacred temple language to a Roman tax collector collecting denarii for Caesar is just, it's absurd.
It really is.
It's like calling an IRS auditor a high priest.
That's exactly what it's like. It would be theological whiplash for his original audience.
Yeah.
If the traditional reading holds, Paul is taking a sacred priestly term that he otherwise reserves strictly for Christ and apostolic ministry, and he's applying it to pagan bureaucrats.
Which makes no sense.
Not at all. The essay argues it makes infinitely more sense that these liturgoi are those who served in the economy of God's kingdom.
Meaning Christ and the apostles.
Exactly. Christ himself and the apostles commissioned by him to do his work.
Okay, let's step out of the grammar and the Greek definitions for a second and look at the actual people reading this letter.
And historical context.
Right. Because the realization that this text wasn't a command to bow down to Rome naturally brings up the historical reality of early oppressed Christians.
Yeah, it certainly does.
If you're a Christian in the first few centuries, Rome is not your friend.
They are actively hunting you.
Right. And here's where the essay introduces a genuinely shocking piece of textual evidence regarding the Sahidic Coptic version of the New Testament.
Yes, we have to look at the textual tradition of the Coptic Church in Egypt.
What did they do?
The Sahidic or Southern Coptic version of the New Testament does something remarkable. It entirely omits Romans 13, verses 1 through 6.
Wait, they just aren't there at all?
Completely missing.
Wow.
And this isn't some fringe theory. It's documented by major scholars like George W. Horner and William G. Johnson.
That's crazy. Why would they leave it out?
Well, when you examine the historical reality of those believers, the mechanism behind that omission becomes very apparent. The Coptic Church in Egypt suffered horrific, systematic persecution under Roman authority.
We are talking about the Desert Fathers, the martyrs of Alexandria, communities that were being decimated by the empire.
Exactly.
Right, and you don't painstakingly hand copy a manuscript that says, God put this emperor here to slaughter us, so pay your taxes and submit, unless you have a major caveat.
You really don't.
It is inconceivable that those Christians, watching their families be executed by the state, would uncritically preserve that text if they thought it meant what modern politicians say it means.
It forces us to ask how texts survive and are curated in the ancient world. I mean, you preserve what you value and what aligns with your ultimate truth.
Right.
The essay argues that this omission in the Sahidic Coptic tradition reflects a profound hermeneutical discernment by those Egyptian believers.
Meaning they made a deliberate choice based on their theology.
Yes. They looked at those verses and determined one of two things. Either it was a later interpolation added by a pro-state scribe after the Constantinian shift, or if it was genuinely written by Paul, it absolutely had to be read Christologically.
It was about submitting to Christ.
Exactly, because they simply could not reconcile a pro-empire reading with their lived reality of martyrdom.
Man, if you're listening to this and you grew up hearing Romans 13 quoted in church, or maybe by politicians on the news demanding compliance to a new law,
Yeah,
this probably feels like having the rug pulled out from under you.
I'm sure it does.
But the text gets even more radical when you zoom out, because if early persecuted Christians couldn't reconcile a pro-empire reading, does that reading even fit within the rest of Paul's letter?
Not at all. If we connect this to the broader biblical narrative, reading Romans 13 as a mandate for state submission violently clashes with the radical counterpolitics found everywhere else in the New Testament.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You just have to look at the immediate literary context of the letter to the Romans itself. Just one chapter earlier, in Romans 12, Paul explicitly commands the believers, do not be conformed to this world.
Or do not conform to this age, which strongly implies an act of resistance to the current cultural and political systems.
Precisely. And then immediately following the devoted verses in chapter 13, the passage climaxes with intense, almost aggressive military language.
Right, the armor.
Paul writes that the night is far gone, the day is at hand, so cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. The Greek word he uses there is hopla, meaning literal weapons of war.
Wow.
And he finishes the thought by commanding them to put on the Lord Jesus Christ.
It's almost like a transfer of citizenship. Like the whole chapter starts with submitting to the surpassing authority and ends with putting on the Lord Jesus Christ as a kind of militant armor.
Because the supreme authority is Jesus Christ. The essay argues that the entire chapter isn't some civic duty checklist. It's about transferring your absolute allegiance from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of the Son.
It's an active, militant spiritual stance, not a passive submission to the local magistrate.
Exactly.
The essay also goes broader, looking at how the New Testament views earthly political power in general. And it's definitely not a flattering picture.
No, it's really not.
It highlights that Satan is actually depicted as the ruler of this world's political systems.
We see the mechanics of this most clearly in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, during the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness.
Right. The devil shows him all the kingdoms.
Yes. The devil shows Jesus all the kingdoms of the world and explicitly claims that their authority, their exousia, has been handed over to him. Satan literally says, I will give you all this authority.
And logically, if worldly political authority inherently belonged to God as a divine ordained institution, Satan couldn't offer it as a temptation.
Exactly.
He'd be offering something he didn't even own, which wouldn't be a temptation at all.
That's spot on. The very fact that Satan possesses and offers the exousia of world kingdoms proves that earthly governments, in the biblical worldview, are heavily compromised and under the dominion of the evil one.
Wow.
They are not God's perfectly ordained instruments of good. We see this echoed vividly in the book of Revelation, chapter 13, which depicts worldly empire as a beast.
Oh, right, the dragon and the beast.
Yes, and the text specifically says the dragon representing Satan gave the beast his power, his throne, and great authority. It uses the exact same Greek word exousia that we've been unpacking in Romans 13.
And we know this wasn't just like theoretical ivory tower theology for the early church. It dictated how they actually lived and died.
It was their daily reality.
Right. The apostles explicitly practiced civil disobedience. In the book of Acts, Peter and the apostles are brought before the authorities and commanded to stop teaching, and Peter just flat out tells them, we must obey God rather than men.
Exactly.
If Romans 13 taught unconditional submission to the government, Peter was actively violating his own scripture.
It creates a massive, unresolvable logical contradiction within the text itself if you try to maintain the traditional pro-state reading.
But let me push back a little on Paul himself.
Yeah.
If Paul genuinely taught that believers should only submit to Christ and not the state, Why did he spend years in Roman prisons? I mean, he was repeatedly arrested, beaten, and imprisoned by the civil authorities.
The essay actually highlights that as the ultimate irony of the traditional reading.
How so?
Paul's own lived experience obliterates the idea that he preached state compliance. In Acts 17, the actual legal charge brought against Paul and his followers by the authorities is that they act against the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, Jesus.
Wait, so he was literally charged with treason?
He was. His entire public ministry was deeply anti-imperial. He spent his life proclaiming Jesus as Basilius and Kyrios, titles that in the first century Roman world belonged exclusively to Caesar.
To apply those absolute titles to a crucified Jewish rabbi wasn't just a religious disagreement.
Not at all. It was an act of profound political subversion. Paul was eventually executed by the very state that the traditional reading of Romans 13 claims he told everyone to blindly obey.
It really does make you rethink everything you thought you knew about that era.
It really shifts the paradigm.
We've covered a massive amount of historical and linguistic ground today, looking at this essay by Frank Leo and his colleagues.
We really have.
The core takeaway for you as a listener is that the traditional reading of Romans 13, the exact reading used for centuries to justify the divine right of kings, the horrors of slavery, and brutal fascist regimes, isn't just a slight mistranslation.
No, the essay argues it is a catastrophic fundamental misreading of the text.
It inverts the entire purpose of the passage.
It does. When you look at the mechanics of the Greek words for authority and ministry,
Right.
when you look at the Syriac translation emphasizing a priesthood,
Yeah.
and when you see the Coptic Church outright rejecting the pro-state interpretation to survive brutal persecution, a completely different, much more cohesive picture emerges.
Rather than a heavy-handed demand to passively submit to earthly rulers, the original languages reveal a subversive rallying cry.
Exactly.
The true disciple of Christ, according to this rereading of Paul, is meant to be armed with weapons of light, standing actively against the oppressive, compromised powers of this dark age.
And submitting only to the supreme surpassing authority of Christ the servant king.
It completely shifts the passage from a blunt tool of imperial control into a profound manifesto of spiritual and political resistance.
It really is a massive paradigm shift.
Which leaves us with a lingering thought to mull over, going all the way back to that idea of a tampered contract we started with.
Right.
The authors of this essay frame their work as correcting a 2,000-year-old mistake. But if a single politically convenient translation shift in just one chapter of an ancient text could be successfully weaponized to justify centuries of empire, slavery, and tyranny,
It makes you wonder.
what other foundational texts in our history, our laws, or our cultures have we simply accepted at face value purely because the people in power were the ones who translated the blueprint for us?